Hi, I'm Glenn Greenwald of the Intercept, and my guest today is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a first-time candidate running in the Democratic Party primary, challenging the 10-term Democratic Congressman incumbent, Joseph Crowley, in New York's 14th Congressional District, which covers Queens and the Bronx. Thanks so much for taking the time out from the campaign trail to talk to me today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Glenn.
Sure. So the dominant political figure in U.S. politics over the past 18 months or 2 years has obviously been Donald Trump. And there are a lot of Democrats who believe that the only political priority that matters, the only one that we ought to be focusing on, is removing Trump from office or figuring out how to defeat him and not arguing amongst Democrats or criticizing other Democrats. And along those lines, there's a lot of Democrats who believe, especially now, the only priority that matters in 2018 is having the Democrats retake the House and perhaps the Senate as well. And yet you're kind of cutting against both of those objectives. You are spending a lot of time critiquing the Democratic Party establishment and the Democratic Party incumbent, and are also risking a very safe seat, some might say, by trying to supplant someone who has proven they can win quite easily. Why do you think it is important, if you do, to have this kind of internal debate among Democrats about what the party should be when Donald Trump is president?
Yeah, so I think that even if the priority of Democrats was to get rid of Donald Trump, they aren't doing a very good job. The party is very split over even voting on impeachment of him. And I also think that if the main priority really is fighting this administration, then we need to address the systemic problems which kind of resulted in his rise in the first place. And that is the perpetuation of economic, social, and racial injustice in the United States, which has really just led to a rift that has allowed the rise of a demagogue like Donald Trump. And so for as long as the Democratic Party continues to work with special interests, lobbyist groups and corporations to really perpetuate economic marginalization of Americans as well as social and racial marginalization, then we're not going to get anywhere. And in fact, one of the reasons why I'm forcing this conversation now is because in order for us to get past this, we have to return to working class and social advocacy of everyday Americans. There's no way we can get through this without changing the Democratic Party.
So there's obviously a lot of discussion about why Donald Trump won. There's a lot of emphasis on the role that Russia might have played, on various shenanigans that took place as part of the general election. Do you look at the Democratic Party itself as in some way being responsible for the rise of Trumpism and the sort of national dominance of the Republican Party, both on the federal and the state level?
I do. I just think that our political establishment, both parties, even in the Republican primaries, you had Jeb Bush. In the Democratic primaries, of course, you had folks like Hillary Clinton. And I just really don't think that they took the pain of a lot of Americans seriously enough. And I don't just mean rural, white, working class American pain, but I also mean the pain of African Americans in Ferguson, the pain of undocumented immigrants here in New York 14. I think by not taking our pains and our needs seriously enough, we created this opening to channel that pain and that anger into, I think, a political fit, which I think it was the election of Donald Trump. And so I do think that there is some responsibility on all sides. I do think that the role of Russian interference was aggressive in the election, but that didn't get Donald Trump to 40% in the polls. It didn't get him to 45% in the polls. He spoke very directly to a lot of needs that were not being met by both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And I think playing on those needs it was part of his ascent. And our ignorance to that or our neglect of that is something that we wholeheartedly have to take responsibility for and correct for.
So you gave an interview to CBS, I believe the morning show this week. It might have been yesterday or even today. And you said something that was really interesting when asked why you were running. You said, quote, "The Democratic Party has been drifting from the real needs of working class New Yorkers, especially those like us in Queens and the Bronx. I paraphrase that last part. What did you mean by that? If the Democratic Party is not focused on the real needs of the working class, whose interests are they focused on? Whose interest are they serving instead?
I mean, that's a softball, Glenn.
Well, I don't think for a lot of people the answer is obvious. So I guess I'm interested in yours.
I mean, so for me, I actually think a lot of Americans understand and they know that the role of money in politics is extraordinarily corrosive, and that the Democratic Party is not immune from that. My opponent takes an insane amount of money from luxury real estate developers, from private equity groups, from pharmaceutical corporations and private insurance corporations, and that is tied directly to the legislation that he's been passing. And you look at, for example, 8 or 7 of his top 10 donors are primarily Republican financiers. His number 2 top donor, Blackstone, they primarily finance the Trump presidency, and moreover, they are really sucking the island of Puerto Rico dry as we try to approach a just recovery. And there's no coincidence that 2 years ago, Joe Crowley voted for the Promesa Act, which essentially allowed Wall Street takeover of the island and allowed private equity groups to essentially take over privatization of the island. Hurricane Maria was just waiting to happen, but we created the financial infrastructure for once a disaster did occur for a recovery and all of this stuff that we're seeing here too. My family's related. I have family in Puerto Rico. We see what's happening on the island. And the idea that these are partisan issues, I think, is a joke. It's been happening with the Democratic Party has allowed this to happen. And it's because they're not taking these issues seriously enough. And, a lot of those members may bristle when I talk about this, but it's because we are speaking directly to the needs of our constituents. And for a very long time, a lot of Democrats have felt like we have to somehow compromise with the lobbyists that are financing their campaigns. But once we break free from that system where we start to finance our own campaigns with grassroots donations, we're able to speak more directly to the needs of American people. And I think that if the Democratic Party is to survive this thing, that's the direction that we really need to start trending in.
So obviously immigration is an important issue, both in terms of our national politics, but also in your campaign. You're from a district where there's a high percentage of immigrants who compose the voting population of this district. And there tends to be this kind of way that we talk about immigration where Trump came in and instituted these really draconian and inhumane immigration policies, but prior to Trump, under President Obama, things were very humane for immigrants and welcoming. And there's been some incidents over the past few weeks that I found really interesting. There was a photograph of an immigration detention camp that went viral because it showed children in cages, and everybody was very outraged about this, and then it turned out that it was actually a photo from 2014. There was an ACLU report documenting hideous immigration abuses that everybody talked about until they realized that the report actually covered the years under President Obama. There was just last night a case that went viral on Twitter from an MSNBC journalist who flagged a woman who Homeland Security is trying to send back to El Salvador, even though she was forced to watch her husband dig his own grave and then watched him be killed by the rebels and then was essentially put into slavery by those rebels. And now Homeland Security wants to send her back. People were outraged by this. And then it turns out that Homeland Security has been trying to deport her for at least 6 years under the Obama administration. So in an interview with my colleague Jeremy Scahill, you said something specific about immigration that you just said now, which is immigration has never been a partisan issue. The Democratic Party has not been a party of immigrants. Could you talk about what you mean by it's never been a partisan issue, both within the immigration context and then sort of more broadly about the need to have more contrast between the two parties?
Yeah, and I think that this moment is an opportunity for the Democratic Party to be a party that champions immigrants and just immigration. But historically, it hasn't been. Immigration has never really been a partisan issue. There is there is historical precedent, George W. Bush and even back to Reagan. Reagan is the only president that's really passed amnesty, full-blown amnesty for undocumented people in the United States. That was a Republican president that did that. I think for a very long time, immigration was kind of this political football that we didn't, we kind of played to the winds of it. When Democrats wanted to be very hard on enforcement, it's very similar to criminal justice reform. The Democratic Party hasn't always been great on issues of criminal justice either. And these are, at their core, issues of race very often in the United States. And historically, I think the party has kind of tried to read the political winds, usually around a presidential cycle. And if a president needed to seem harder line or a little bit more, as President Trump likes to talk about it, rule of law, if they wanted to seem a little bit harder or more authoritarian, they would take a harder stance on these issues. But now that we have someone like President Trump, now we're seeing immigration becoming a little bit more of a partisan issue, in that the Republicans are somehow, complicit and created this system, and Democrats did not. But, I think authoritarian structures in government are bipartisan. And what we really need to do is use this opportunity, now that we've seen how far unjust structures like ICE can be taken, we can take this opportunity to correct that history. But we have to do it, and we have to be willing to claim it. And we can't just be willing to just read the wind, be okay on it for now, and just say, we can't just wag our finger at the Trump presidency. I think this is our opportunity to really champion and re-envision what American immigration can look like.
So let me just switch gears a little bit. Last month, the Israeli government shot more than 1,000 peaceful, unarmed protesters in Gaza, killing hundreds of them. And on May 14th, at the height of that attack, you posted the following on Twitter. You wrote, quote, "This is a massacre," meaning the Israeli military shooting of Palestinian protesters. And then you wrote, quote, "I hope my peers have the moral courage to call it as such. No state or entity is absolved of mass shooting of protesters. There is no justification. Palestinian people deserve basic human dignity as anyone else. Democrats can't be silent about this anymore." Now, as your tweet suggests, the reason why I think that tweet got a lot of attention, I know the reason why it captured my attention, is because it's very rare to hear somebody in mainstream politics talking about, in such clear moral terms, denouncing the Israeli government's aggression and militarism that way. And it's particularly true for a New York politician, where the idea has always been that it is political suicide not to be unyieldingly loyal to the actions of the Israeli government and supportive of it. So I just wanted to ask you two questions about that positioning that you made. First is, did you decide that it actually could be politically beneficial to take that position, or did you believe that you needed to take that position as a moral imperative regardless of the political cost? And then more broadly, do you see a relationship between these kinds of foreign policy issues that don't get quite as much attention these days and the domestic issues that are the focus of your campaign and also of our politics?
Yeah, to answer your first question, I think that really where that came from for me is my background is as an educator, an organizer, and an activist. And I think I was primarily compelled on moral grounds because I could only imagine if 60 people were shot and killed in Ferguson, or if 60 people were shot and killed, in the West Virginia teacher strikes. The idea that we are not supposed to talk about people dying when they are, engaging in political expression, just really moved me. And running for office, seeing like the silence around this issue has been, a little interesting to me. So a little bit about my background as well. As I mentioned before, my family's from Puerto Rico. And so Puerto Rico is in the United States. It is a colony that is granted no rights, that has no civic representation. And if 60 people were shot in protest of the United States negligence in FEMA and kind of keeping us on that island, I couldn't even imagine if there was silence on that. But also, I think that politically and domestically, I think that in the same way, that the same lens that I looked at it, people, I think, are separating the actions and the status of Palestinians from even like the greater, I think, geopolitics of the area. I think people are starting to just look more at the state, the humanitarian state of Palestinian people through a humanitarian lens. And, people say, like, in New York City, this is political suicide and so on. But also, I had a lot of my own constituents thanking me for taking that position. And I have a very large, New York 14 is the most diverse district in America. We're very happy to have a lot of Jewish Americans that thanked me for my position. I had a lot of Muslim Americans. We have very strong Muslim populations in our district. And I don't even see this as a political issue, especially through the frame of that one incident. And especially coming from the background as an activist, I just think that we need to talk about these things, and we need to talk about the basic humanitarian rights that should be afforded to all people, including the freedom of political expression.
Earlier, you mentioned the issue of criminal justice reform, which is finally starting to get more attention in mainstream political discourse. And obviously, the United States is the country that imprisons more of its citizens than any other country in the world, both in terms of absolute numbers, but also proportionally. And a major cause of that, not the only cause, but a major cause of it, both on the federal level, but also certainly in New York, is the issue of the criminalization of drugs. It not only lets the government put lots of people, primarily minorities and poor people, into prison for using drugs or buying drugs, but it also justifies things like the stop and frisk policy and just general intrusions and police dominance of minority communities. What is your position on the legalization of marijuana first, and then also more broadly on the legalization or the decriminalization of all drugs?
I completely support the full legalization of marijuana. I do think that as we approach the legalization of marijuana, unsurprisingly, there are a lot of lobbies trying to shape that legalization, and I think it's important that we don't rush to legalize in a way that just further concentrates the wealth of that legalization into pharmaceutical lobbies and healthcare providers. I think that we really need to maintain a high standard in the way that Colorado has approached legalization, as opposed to for example, my own state of New York. New York has approached the medical legalization of marijuana in a really terrible way, by which pharmaceutical lobbyists and have an extraordinarily large influence in how marijuana is legalized, and that makes it very difficult for everyday people to really even A, obtain a prescription, or B, be able to kind of access this in a more democratic way. So I do support a just legalization of marijuana. As for the legalization of all drugs, I think that there are definitely, I think we see models like in Portugal that have shown that we really just need to, I think, approach drugs as a health issue. These are health-related substances. A lot of times they're related to mental health. And as we see with the opioid crisis, we're seeing a lot of people trying to approach this holistically. And I don't think that we're not seeing a push to further criminalize people using opioids. We're really trying to approach this through a health lens. So I think that when we talk about the legalization of all drugs, I think it's an important conversation to have. Moreover, when you look at certain other drugs with also just plain promising initial clinical results for people like veterans with PTSD, things like MDMA, things like things like psilocybin that seem to actually have potential medical or psychiatric benefits to those with needs. I think we really need to start thinking about how we approach this issue again through a health lens. So I'm interested in seeing how we can move in that direction. And I'm frankly, I'm just interested in just learning more and sitting both with medical professionals and looking at models like Portugal and how this has approached as a public health issue.
Let me ask you about the issue of what is often called identity politics, which is the debate around which is playing a significant role in your race and in others. You talk a lot about, quite proudly, your Puerto Rican heritage. Your opponent, like most leaders in New York, is a white male. Your district, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but certainly there's a very large percentage of the residents in your district, if not a majority, who are non-white. The debate around identity politics, and I know that you've been criticized by your opponent, Congressman Crowley, and his supporters for practicing what they call identity politics. The debate around that is often defined by kind of two extreme poles. And on the one hand, you can take the position that we should just automatically vote for the non-white male candidate because diversity is just inherently good, and therefore people should vote for you and not him because he's a white male and you're not. The other pole, the extreme pole, is one that says that identity and race and gender should play no role at all in deciding who we vote for, that instead we should just vote for the candidate who has the best ideology, who's best qualified, who's going to do the best for the district. And then there's kind of a middle ground that says that it's not the determinative factor, but it is an important factor because it's what enables people to have representation from people who understand what their life is like and the experiences that they've gone through. So what is your position just generally on that identity politics debate, and what role do you think it ought to have for voters in the 14th Congressional District when deciding who they should vote for?
It's an excellent question because sometimes people throw this term around, identity politics, and a lot of people, when they use that term, they'll all mean something different. And so in terms of using the term identity politics as vote for me, I am XYZ, to use that as the sole basis for voting for someone, I think is incorrect and it's flawed. Because, there are a lot of, I think, there are a lot of Trojan horses. There are a lot of folks that say, vote for me, I am this intersection of different identities, but at the same time, they still try to advance or are primarily financed by special interests. So it doesn't necessarily get us to where we need to be. At the same time, I think that a lot of our problems sometimes that we have here, our current social problems, are due to the fact that we've ignored a lot of the history of the United States along issues of race, religion, class, and creed. And because we don't want to discuss the fact that, for example, slavery has essentially evolved to Jim Crow, which evolved into our mass incarceration system, to pretend that mass incarceration is not tied to race, to pretend that current immigration policy is not tied to racism or xenophobia, I think is also a mistake. I am running, and my identity is important because the district is about 70% people of color. The district is about 40% primarily Spanish-speaking. It's at least half Latino. And the fact that I am a Hispanic woman, it's not the fact that I'm a Hispanic woman that allows me to better represent this district. It is the fact that that is a lens that I have to better organize and communicate with the people who live here. When we see the history, we have to look at what's been a priority. I think it would be one question if Joe Crowley made criminal justice a priority in his tenure. It would be one question. It would be another question if he bothered to learn Spanish in the 20 years that he's been in office. It would be another question if he's actually passed comprehensive immigration reform. But he hasn't done any of those things. And as a result, he's failed our communities. And I do think that my perspective, actually living in this district, because he lives in Virginia full-time as well. All of these things add up to effective representation. And our identities, whether we like it or not, are a lens. We can never take that lens off. And the whole point of Congress is that when we have multiple lenses together, we can able to achieve effective legislation that champions all of us. But when all of Congress, especially a seat like this one, comes from the lens of one gender and one race, and also one class or one type of economic background, there's no way that all of those lenses together, when they primarily come from one lens, can champion all Americans. Right now, Congress is 80% one gender and very predominantly one race. And that creates massive blind spots for our legislation. It creates blind spots in criminal justice reform. It creates blind spots in the legalization of marijuana. And it creates blind spots in how we talk about and how we approach these issues. So if this district, which is 70% people of color, which is half immigrant, which is extremely working class, does not have any of those qualities reflected in our representation, how can we hope to have those qualities represented in our legislation? And so I think it's an important lens to look at. It's not just because of the color of my skin or my gender, but it's the lenses through which we are electing these things that I think is an important factor. It's not the factor. At the end of the day, I'm a candidate that doesn't take corporate money, that champions Medicare for all, a federal jobs guarantee, the abolishment of ICE, and a Green New Deal. But I approach those issues with the lenses of the community that I live in. And that is not as easy to say as identity politics, but I think it's something that our constituents understand on a very deep level.
So we just have a little bit of time left. Let me just ask you a couple of what I hope are quick questions. Your opponent, Congressman Crowley, has been pretty upfront about his hopes to replace Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer in the Democratic top wing of the Democratic leadership once they retire, or maybe even before that. For as long as I can remember, the Democratic Party in the House has been led by Nancy Pelosi and Steny Hoyer. So if you are elected, will you agitate for different leaders leading the Democratic Party in the House caucus, or do you think that Pelosi and Hoyer should continue to be in those leadership positions?
No, I think that we need new leadership. I think the idea that we should have the same leadership for more than one generation is probably a mistake in American politics in general. When I think about my opponent trying to take Nancy Pelosi's seat, it's like, why? Like, what has he done? And I think that what we need to really look at and value, it goes back down to the idea of valuing fundraising and equating fundraising with leadership. And they're not the same thing. I think that we really need to start kind of changing our standards for leadership and what we define and what we respect as a party. And it's not to say that it's not to speak to Pelosi's leadership, but it's to say, what company oftentimes has the same CEO for 20 years? Or, it's very rare that happens. And what government has the same president for 20 years? And the idea that the third most powerful seat in the country should just be rotated in and out by the same two people for generations, I think is a mistake in our government. Government is supposed to be responsive. And I'm just kind of inclined to think that we should be responsive in our leadership as well.
So my last question is about the issue of machine politics. There was just in New Jersey a development that shocked a lot of people, which is that Robert Menendez, despite being indicted for multiple felony counts by the Obama Justice Department, which ended in a hung jury, and despite being severely admonished by the Senate Ethics Committee, ran basically unopposed for the Democratic Party nomination for Senate because the whole Democratic machine in New Jersey united behind him, and it made it impossible to mount a credible challenge against him. In Queens and New York politics generally, it's often said, I think accurately, that too is run by machine politics. Your opponent is known, I think he's claimed the title, as the King of Queens, suggesting that he kind of is the machine boss of Queens politics, which is obviously something that you've encountered. You've had very little establishment support, basically none, either at the national level or at the local level. Can you talk about what the challenges have been for you in terms of trying to mount a challenge against that kind of a machine apparatus? I know there was an incident covered by our politics reporters where you decided you weren't going to ask the LGBT club in Queens, the Democratic Party LGBT club in Queens, for their endorsement because you assumed it would just automatically go to your opponent as the machine works, and then some suggestion that maybe you regretted that. So can you talk a little bit about what machine politics are like in Queens and the obstacles they pose and why that matters?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's important to talk here about, in this specific case, the congressman is not just the congressman, he's also the chairman of the Queens Democratic Party. So every single Democratic club in Queens has to answer to my opponent, which creates, I think, a very strong chilling effect, aside from the fact that it's an astounding conflict of interest, that he's responsible for his own endorsement by the party. It creates a chilling effect, and it creates a chilling effect, I think, for authentic democracy and authentic candidates who actually want to court some of these needs. And in that particular case, it was I just really felt like, as someone who was not asking permission from the boss, I can't really ask permission for any of the boss's employees, which is essentially these Democratic clubs to their chairman. So what our campaign has really tried to do, for example, is really approach that type of organizing. For example, we went to the Jim Moles Liberal Democratic Club, which was founded in the wake of the Stonewall riots, and we've approached, for example, DSAs, Democratic Socialists of America. We look towards their kind of gender caucuses and LGBT caucuses for that kind of leadership. But it absolutely does create a chilling effect, because one of the first times I went to a Democratic club, they heard in the area, they heard that I was coming, and they rushed to endorse Joe Crowley before I arrived. And so it kind of just felt like, what is the point of participating in these existing systems if they are so strongly top down instead of bottom up? And it is hurtful to our entire democracy when we govern by machine instead of govern by voice, by the people. So the control of these political machines, I think, is partially responsible for the destabilization of our politics and the weakening of the Democratic Party. The desire to control the outcome instead of the desire to really strengthen our systems is a mistake. And so in terms of how I've approached and my challenges in the party, one of those things is that what we found actually is that top-down system is weaker than I even thought. And there are a lot of people in this machine, including the Queens Lesbian and the Lesbian and Gay Democratic Club of Queens, that were actually more open, perhaps, to having that conversation than it would have even seemed because of Crowley's position as the chairman. So a lot of what it does is that it shuts down conversations that I think a lot of communities want to have. And I really look forward to reconnecting, and opening that conversation now that there's kind of this signaled openness to perhaps even break from the chairman.
Well, thanks to your campaign, the New York Congressional District, the 14th Congressional District, has its first primary election in 14 years, which is amazing. So it's the first time that people in your district actually get to have this debate and choose about what kind of Democratic Party they want to have. So thank you for having that, creating this conversation, which I think everybody, regardless of what side they fall on the debate, should regard as important and valuable. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me again. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me, Glenn.